Hi, Algebra 1. So this is a comprehensive review over 9.1 to 9.4. We're going to be working the beginnings of working with quadratics and parabolas. So as we're moving through, these are the list of standards that all apply for this quiz that you're about to take, so you can see that there's quite a bit in there. As you're moving through, the big thing, if you remember in here, is you're looking really at quadratics and the relationships that they model. So the first thing before we get started, I just want to make sure that you guys realize that all of these things should already be in your notebook, and if they're not, you're welcome to fill them in. Every tile has the notebook icon up in the corner here, every slide does, and that's just to make sure that you realize that this should be in your notes already, and if it's not, you need to write it in there before you take the quiz. So we can see the first is when we're talking about quadratic functions or quadratic equations, they're always in the same format. We're looking for this format of y equals something times x squared plus something times x plus something else, or a plain number on the end here. I gave some examples here. You could have y equals 3x squared. You can see the 3 is substituting in for the a, and then we have our x squared. Separately, you could also have y equals x squared plus 9. So we have our x squared there. We have our 9 in for our c, but our 0 is here in for the b, which makes this term not show at all. And then lastly, down the bottom here, I had another equation that was y equals x squared minus x minus 2. This is just kind of standard format. The a in front of the x squared is a 1. The b is a negative 1. And then the c is a negative 2. At the same time, when you're looking at all of these equations, you should recognize this parent function. And this is, of course, our standard function of y equals x squared. It's a parabola with its minimum point at the origin, which is at the point 0, 0. Now, you better know some vocabulary when it comes to parabolas. The first is that this blue line here shows a parabola. Remember that the vertex can either be the lowest point before it turns, or it can also be the highest point of where it turns, and we'll see an example of that in the next slide. The x-intercepts are also called the zeros of the function, and that's where that graph crosses the x-axis. Then there's also a line of symmetry. That line of symmetry goes through the vertex of the parabola, and if you folded this in half, you would have the same line on both sides. Then lastly, we also have a y-intercept, which is where the parabola crosses the y-axis. So those are the important parts of a parabola, and it's important to make sure you know them all. Next, an important and crucial thing to be able to do on your test is to be able to predict a graph based on looking at the equation. The first and foremost thing you should be able to tell is the difference between a regular y equals x squared equation, which I showed you right down here. Oopsie. Let's go back one. There we go. Okay, so it's the regular y equals x squared equation. Or you should know the y equals a negative x squared, which turns that parabola upside down and changes the vertex from the minimum point, where it is here, to the maximum point on this curve. So you can see here that this is a y equals negative x squared, that's a y equals x squared. Additionally, you should also know the difference between a graph that, say, has a y equals just plain x squared, that's our parent function again, that's that light blue line right there, versus one that might be, say, y equals a 5x squared. You'll notice in our graph here they use the example of 2x squared, and we see that the pitch, if you will, of that parabola gets tighter. It moves it closer to the y-axis. And then lastly, if we do the opposite of that and we take that coefficient in front of the x squared and make it a fraction, then or a fractional part of 1, we can see that that widens the parabola. For the quiz, you should be willing and able to look at different equations and put them in order based on how wide the parabola is. So the widest parabolas would maybe go first, and then the thinnest or the tightest parabolas would go last. Additionally, when you're going through, it is important that you can make a graph by creating a table of values and plotting them on a graph. Remember, when you're dealing with parabolas, you must use positive numbers, negative numbers, and 0, because you have to find those turning points of that graph. So you can see the example here. They had the graph the equation y equals x squared plus 4x plus 3. They chose the values from -4 to 2, and then went through and plugged each of those numbers in for x, solved the equation, and got a y value. They did the same for 1, plugged it in for x, solved the equation, and got a y value. If you need help doing that, you need to ask, because it's important that you can do that for the quiz coming up. Along with that, like William shows you in class, you should be able to use a graphing calculator to enter this equation into your graphing calculator and generate a graph in the calculator. If you're struggling or you don't know how to do that, I've linked a long YouTube video here, but she shows you what you need to know in about the first 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, next in this one, you need to be able on the quiz to find the axis of symmetry and the vertex. I'll show you how to do this one in a minute. We'll walk you through. Again, we're looking for that format y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. This is that standard form of a quadratic function or a parabola. The axis of symmetry is found by taking -b over 2a. You must have this written down in your notes. And then you can also find the x-coordinate of the vertex with using the same value to solve for x, and then plugging it in to solve